Gazprom is dependent on the infrastructure between Siberia and the European Union. These pipelines with Russia would not have this importance anymore. I don't see it a chance for actually, as you said, that Western countries would now pressure Ukraine into something like a Minsk-3 agreement.
Hello and welcome to Ukraine in Flames, a special project by Ukraine Media Center and Euro-Atlantic Course NGO. My name is Lesa Bidochko, and today we'll discuss energy crisis in European Union and its consequences for Ukraine and Russia-Ukraine conflict. Let's turn our attention to our guest today, Andreas Umland, political scientist, analyst at Stockholm Center for Eastern European Studies. Dr. Umland, hello and welcome.
Hello, Dr. Bidochko.
So Europe is facing an extraordinary energy crisis, and Russia has significantly reduced flows of natural gas to Europe, and Western nations has imposed sanctions due to Russia's full-scale invasion in Ukraine. So the energy crisis embraces Europe amid signs that natural gas is becoming too expensive for industrial use and for power generation due to the cutoff of the supplies from Russia. Which political changes would it trigger within European Union and in Germany in particular?
I don't expect political changes, but I now fear that we will have problems here in Germany with regard to especially gas and, as you rightly said, the industrial use of gas. So it's not so much about heating and about electricity for private customers. The issue is rather, will there be enough gas that is used by various industry, especially chemical industry, and metals industry, and there a lot of gas is necessary. And now Germany and other European countries, they're trying to buy gas from other countries via, for instance, LNG, from Norway, for instance, from the US, from Arab countries, but the question will be whether this will be enough, and there could be then indeed some social disturbances and perhaps even political instability if entire enterprises have to close down, and if there is a sharp rise in unemployment. Scenarios like this are now what I think is making people nervous in the European Union, but so far I do not see any direct political consequences from that.
Okay, so you tell that some people might become nervous and anxious due to this situation of the energy crisis. So my question is, maybe some parties and politicians, especially fueled by Russian propaganda and Russian lobbyists, might tell, well, okay, we've helped Ukraine, we still are standing with Ukraine, but why should we pay extra money for gas just because Putin has invaded Ukraine? How realistic is this situation?
Well, there is already a discussion like that. In Germany, the leading party that is promoting this sort of discourse is the far right, the Alternative for Germany, which also has a faction, a smaller faction in the Bundestag, in the German parliament, but it's not part of the government. It's also a stigmatized country, stigmatized for other reasons, so it's not seen as belonging to the German mainstream. But also some individual characters or politicians from other parties are also voicing this sort of critique from the Free Democrats, for instance, or from the center-right parties. So there is something like that already going on, and nevertheless, I so far do not see signs that this will lead to a change in, let's say, the German stance towards Russia, and also in the German policy of support for Ukraine. So far, I think most people understand that we have to keep course, and that this is obviously a pressure that is Putin now exerting, and that we have to withstand. I hope that will remain this way. I'm not entirely sure, but I don't think there is an easy connection between the sort of Russian pressure via gas cuts and the sanctions policy vis-a-vis Russia, and the support, the German support, for instance, for Ukraine, military support and non-military support. So I think in Moscow, most people think this way. They see an easy connection between gas deliveries and these other policies with regard to the conflict to the war in Ukraine. But so far here, these are separate issues, and the German government is trying to solve that somehow. With negotiations with Russia, also with Gazprom, there are negotiations as well, but also with trying to get gas from other exporters,
like alternative exporters.
Yes.
Okay, but amid these challenges with the gas shortage and during the winter, how realistic is the scenario that maybe some EU countries, I do not tell that maybe EU in general, but maybe some EU countries, some informal lobbyists would somehow recommend President Zelensky to get down to negotiations with Putin? Well, in far-reaching perspective, like, would war in Ukraine and this gas crisis force a rethink of the EU foreign policy in general?
So far, I don't see signs for this because the stakes are very high, and it's well understood that what Putin is now doing is in fact imposing sort of counter sanctions. That is not officially announced like that by the Russian government, but it's basically a punishment of the EU and in particular of Germany for its support for Ukraine and for the sanctions against Russia, although that is not made so explicit in the Russian announcements. So that connection does exist already, but I think the situation is now different from 2014 in that we have now already a large package of sanctions imposed. Also, we have a coordinated international support for Ukraine. So there's a certain inertia, I would say, now in keeping this course and in continuing like that. And I don't see it a chance for actually, as you said, that Western countries would now pressure Ukraine into something like a Minsk-3 agreement, something like that. So that is talked about here a lot, but there's also a lesson from the past that with the Minsk-1 and Minsk-2 agreements, we did not reach permanent peace, and now to have a Minsk-3 agreement is maybe also useless for this conflict. And we also have the examples of Moldova and Georgia. So so far, I think the foreign political situation is rather stable, and we will see more pressure, perhaps also more discussion. But I hope the current policy stance will keep in place. And also, I think something that often is forgotten in Western discourses about this issue is that this is, of course, also a very risky policy for Russia to impose these gas sanctions now, because like Germany and the European Union, Gazprom is dependent on the infrastructure between Siberia and the European Union. And so there's a large gas pipeline infrastructure. And if now Gazprom or the Russian state is using this, this so far infrastructural, let's call it this way, dependency on of the European Union on these gas pipelines, it's also hurting itself, because Gazprom too cannot easily export large amounts of gas to other importers of gas. So if now countries like Germany switch their import to other exporters of gas, this is also a loss for Gazprom of a market, of an important market, and Gazprom cannot easily replace the EU market with other markets, because although there is a demand for Russian gas also elsewhere in the world, but Gazprom doesn't have the infrastructure to transport large amounts of gas to these other customers that are potentially there, but are not reachable so far for Gazprom.
Well, thank you for mentioning about the Russian gas infrastructure needed for supplying Europe with gas. My next question is about Polish President Andrzej Duda, who visited Kyiv recently and joined Crimea platform. And during his speech, one of his messages was actually that he voiced that Nord Stream 2 pipeline must be demolished. Like literally, he told that not just end of Nord Stream 2, but its complete liquidation. So is Europe really ready for such a radical step? Is Europe ready to demolish the Nord Stream 2? Or if it doesn't, so it means that actually EU plans to return to importing Russian gas in the future. What's your opinion on this issue?
I think this is a relatively new idea by Duda, and I haven't seen yet much reflection about it. There was earlier some discussion about whether one could perhaps use the existing or parts of the existing Nord Stream 2 infrastructure for transportation of gas within the European Union. So that has been mentioned before. I think there may be also here people, for instance, in Germany, who would be hoping, let's say, for regime change in Russia. And then perhaps one day there may be, again, a demand for this Nord Stream 2 pipeline, and when perhaps it may not be have this geopolitical importance anymore. So I don't see this yet as a major issue. I mean, in terms of some symbolism, it would be nice to do it, but I think people now have simply other things on their mind than dismantling this infrastructure project.
Okay, so you suppose if Putin sometimes steps away as a president, Europe would be ready to have Russia as its gas supplier again, like it's one of the key gas suppliers, right? Or at that time, or at that moment, Europe would have so much alternatives except of Russia that Russia would not be needed in the European market.
Yes, that is an important thing. The last aspect you mentioned, that in a different geo-economic situation, maybe these pipelines with Russia would not have this importance anymore for political issues as they have now, and then one could sort of approach them in very different ways if there are these alternative also providers then of gas and LNG terminals and new pipelines within the European Union and so on. But what is of course necessary for all of that to be restored partly or fully, this trade with Russia, is not only a regime change, I should have said that perhaps, but also a foreign policy change, a fundamental change of foreign policy. And I think what actually now is sort of appearing here more and more, the understanding is now changing of the Russian foreign policy in the West. And I would now also think that for a restoration of the former Russian-EU relationship, one would have to be, Russia would not only have to withdraw its troops from Ukraine, but also from Georgia and from Moldova. So once this has all changed, and perhaps also from Syria, once we have sort of a full rebooting, a restart of Russian foreign policy, where it is not intervening anymore in these neighboring countries and supporting separatists or authoritarian regimes like in Syria, then I think that one could imagine, and perhaps also a domestic democratization. Then one could see indeed a restoration of these trade relationships, and then perhaps even Ukrainian-Russian relations could be partly restored.
Okay, thank you for your honest answers. Thank you for your optimism and realism. You've been watching a special project by Ukraine Media Center and Euro-Atlantic Course NGO dedicated to Russia-Ukraine war, Ukraine in Flames. In description, there is information how personally you can help Ukraine against Russian aggression. If you find our job useful, please like and share this video, and everything is gonna be Ukraine.